beaten paths are for beaten men. Eric Johnson. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me this week. I appreciate all the continued support and listens and downloads. I was kind of worried taking a week off that, the show would kind of maybe fall out of whatever algorithm is causing it to go up the last couple of months. But no, even missing a week for a vacation hasn't impacted things. In fact, it seems like still very steady and very consistent. And I can tell that even some of the older episodes are being listened to. So, to those of you who have joined and are going back through the backlog, I thank you as much as those who are listening to this episode. And for all my long-time listeners, thank you as well. Your consistent support has been very, very helpful. Now, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to this week's topic and probably next week's topic as well. But we're going to be talking about the people of North Africa, west of the Nile River, and its delta, moving toward the Atlantic between 6,000 and 4,000 BC. Before we get to that, though, I did have some questions to respond to about last week's episode, specifically for Osiris and his role as god of the underworld and the dead. I didn't want to go too much into detail, as we have clear evidence of how Egyptian burial processes evolve, and we even have evidence of how the god or gods associated with death and mourning changed over time too. So I want to cover that for a period where burial practices are very clear, these early Egyptian practices, and then how they change. So that's going to be a topic for next season. But I will say it primarily involves the changing role of Anubis, who was the initial god of the dead and the underworld. Another thing I want to talk about that I forgot to mention is the appearance of Set. Mostly he is a man, but his head is more mysterious and debated. Some think he looks like an aardvark. Others say that he's a type of wild dog or jackal, much like Anubis. And others think he could be a donkey. And indeed, in different periods, his head changes. So, it could have been any or all of these things at different times. The donkey is an interesting choice that I hope to cover later when Christianity spreads to Egypt. So please look forward to that. However, he likely shares his head with an animal that was sacred to Set, and he may have transformed into it as well. This is just called the Set beast or Set animal, or as the Egyptians would say, the Shah. And what this animal is supposed to be is even more mysterious than Set's head. Its body and legs appear to be a canid of some type, and its head could be a canid as well, but its ears stick straight up like either a rabbit or an aardvark, and so does its tail. And the tail is capped with like a ball of what may be fur, or I've also seen it referred to as hooded like a cobra, or a king cobra. It also typically has a much longer neck than you would expect for most dog breeds. In fact, I would say all dog breeds. And in some places it is depicted as with a neck that is so long that it has made some people think it depicts a giraffe. Though we do know that the Egyptians understood what a giraffe was and had a separate term for that animal. But that's kind of what I didn't really talk about last week and wanted to kind of answer some feedback. So for now, let's move to the rest of Northern Africa. So, as we discussed in other areas this season, the Sahara has been desertifying slowly but steadily for the last couple of thousand years. And much like Sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa and its peoples are also being affected by this climatic event. As some people were forced to migrate further south, others made the decision to move north and live along the Mediterranean coast. We will get to these peoples, but for now I will go ahead and just reiterate that all of these peoples moving north or south had probably been in these areas prior to the season, but with the Sahara drying out, it forced much larger and more permanent migration out of the region. That said, there will still be ways for people to live in the Sahara, and the region is never completely abandoned. Some areas in and around mountains in the region remain greener for longer, but large-scale permanent cities and towns aren't really viable, at least for this season and probably the next one as well. But the area sees a massive drop in population and, of course, travel throughout the region. And people still living there would cluster in and around the rapidly dwindling water sources. These areas are, of course, what we know today as oases or oasi, depending on how you want to pluralize that, but I believe the correct term is oases. And of course, the singular is oasis, and it entered into English from the French, who got it directly from the Romans, who got it directly from the Greeks. And the Greeks probably got it from the Egyptian wahe or oahe, which meant dwelling place, evolving from their word we, or dwell. And some believe the Egyptians also loaned the word to the Semitic languages, such as Hebrew and Arabic. The Arabic word for oasis is waha or wahat, depending on the region the speaker is from. Arabic has a lot of different regional dialects. And the Hebrew language used nave or nava. It is one of these oases, that I am going to turn to now. And this is the Siwa oasis. Siwa is the Arabic name that they probably adopted from the later Coptic Egyptian Su, or So, which evolved from the Egyptian term for oasis, and their name for this specific oasis. The Egyptians knew the region as Sekhet Am, meaning palm land. Though there are those that contend it had a double meaning, with the Am being an abbreviation for Amun, or a double meaning for both palm land and the home of Amun, or the dwelling of Amun. But the reason for this is, and we'll talk about this more later, but there's a very famous oracle dedicated to Amun that was located in this region. Though I also saw in some places that it was called Sekhet Yaru, which is translated as field of trees, which should not be confused with Sekhet Aru, which is A-A-R-U, whereas Siwa was I-A-R-U. That meant, or Sekhet Aru, which is the field of reeds. This is also just called Aru, which is part of the Egyptian afterlife that I will again get into next season. Now, today, this is within the borders of Egypt, but this area and several other smaller oasi occupying the western portion of Desheret, the Red Land, were not always under direct Egyptian control, and even when they were also home to a number of non-Egyptian peoples, and these peoples had been living in and around the oasis since at least 10,000 BC, sometime between 10 and 9,000 BC, technically. And it is also possible the very name of Siwa, or at least part of it, may have come from these people. There is a theory that the indigenous name for the oasis may have been Sa or Se. And that sound the Egyptians adopted into their own name for the location. And these people are the ancestors of some of the, technically all probably, but these people are the ancestors of the modern Berber or Amazigh people. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not using the term Berber as a pejorative. I am merely using it because it is the most recognized term for these peoples in English. And I have had it drilled into me as well, just from textbooks and things like that from my school days. But I will be trying to use Amazigh, or the name for a specific group of Amazigh, as often as possible, though unless I am quoting, a source or something like that, I'll probably still use the term Berber. Like giving an etymological breakdown of the term Berber and for Amazigh. Now, Berber comes from the archaic Greek barbaroi. It is a popularly accepted theory that the Greeks came up with the term for mocking how outsiders spoke. Like they would just say bar, bar, bar. And that's how the Greeks came up with the term barbaroi. And that's sort of true, but really what they meant was it was someone who did not speak a pure Greek dialect, or who could not speak one of these dialects without a very obvious accent. That said, the Greeks applied that term to a lot of people, a lot of different people, including the Amazigh, though there were always cases of the Greeks using specific names of peoples in addition to just calling them barbarians. That said, the Arabs adopted the term Barbara. That's how they understood barbarian to be pronounced. And that meant to babble, or to just jabber on or jaw off or whatever. And they applied it specifically to the various non-Arab speaking North Africans, and that cemented the term in the European languages lexicon because, of course, the people that the Europeans were dealing most commonly with in the region were Arabs. The Arabs were in charge of a lot of the trade routes, at least at the point that the Europeans would be interacting with those trade routes, so they learned from the Arabs that these were the Berber people. Now, as for Amazigh, this is a collective term, mainly used in English, or at least when these people are referring to themselves in English, and I think in other languages too, though you'll sometimes see it called Tamazight. Although there is some debate about that, because Tamazight is sometimes used to refer to a specific Berber language group, so to kind of help prevent confusion between the entire people as the whole, and that specific language of the Berber language family, which is Afro-Asiatic. They differentiate between Amazigh and Tamazight. But in English, when people are using this, you'll typically see Amazigh as the written form. And that's used, again, collectively to refer to all of the North African peoples, indigenous North African peoples. There are several million speakers of Amazigh languages. They're mostly in Morocco and Algeria, though they do have some exclaves in Mali, Libya, I believe Tunisia as well, Egypt, specifically around the Siwa Oasis. There's a specific branch still spoken there called Siwi. Very few people still speak that, though. I think it's around 10,000, and there are even some, I think, around Burkina Faso, so like south of the Sahara, along the coast there. But now, not to get too much into modern history, but kind of establishing like a group, kind of nationalistic almost. Identity among the Amazigh people has become something that is being kind of pushed more and more, despite the fact that the Berbers, the Amazigh and the Arabs have lived alongside each other for a long time, and there is a lot of intermixing between the groups, but there's still kind of a cultural battle going on. Not necessarily a violent one, though in some cases it is, but more in just kind of like trying to establish their own national identity. And since a lot of North Africa got independence in the, from the 1940s onward, a lot of people in charge of those countries have kind of forced Arabic to be used, and it kind of caused a little bit of decline or tensions to rise in those countries, and there are several independence movements for Amazigh peoples, but you do see, at least in some cases, where the Berber languages are trying to make a comeback. And again, I do apologize for dropping that every now and then. I am trying to do better, and the reason I care somewhat, it's not a huge cause for me, but I do have several listeners who are from Northern Africa. If you guys ever come by the stream sometimes, I have 3 or 4 people from various parts of Northern Africa who come and hang out, and I appreciate you guys, and thank you for coming out and actually giving me some good information for some of this stuff, and I'm hoping I'm going to be able to continue to use that. But regardless, that's the origin of Amazigh and Berber, respectfully. And we're going to go ahead and kind of move on to the ancestors of these people. And I should note that they are indigenous to this region. Even when other outside groups come in, the Amazigh people retain at least a pretty solid ethnic makeup, and part of that is their lifestyle. They are still fairly, or at least some of them are still fairly nomadic, though again with the modern world that's not as easy to do anymore, but they kind of resist centralized authority in a lot of cases. There are exceptions, and they themselves will establish several kingdoms and things like that. Maybe not a state as we would define it here in the West, but definitely, a political organization at the very least that might not be centered around land, but instead may be loyalty to a specific extended family or kin group, or in some cases just a very charismatic leader. And that's how we know about the earliest organized groups of these peoples. Specifically, the Egyptians comment on peoples living to the west of them along the coasts, and in the Oasi, in Deshret, in the Red Land. We're jumping ahead a little here, but the earliest written sources about the Western North Africans are from, I think, 1300s BC, give or take 100 years or so, and they detail contacts with Libya, or as the Egyptians knew it, the Libu or Ribu. We're still not 100% on the pronunciation, but that is where the name Libya comes from the Libu people. Or Libo is also another kind of hypothetical pronunciation. And of course, that's what the Greeks knew of North Africa as well. They used the same term. For Northern Africa, they had Egypt and they had Libya, and that was to them what Africa was. Later, they'll learn about Ethiopia, but the continent as a whole, I think they more typically used Libya to describe Africa. Africa comes to us, I think, from the Romans a little bit later. But yes, so the Libu gave their names to Libya, or at least the Egyptian name for the Libu. I'm not sure if we know what they referred to themselves as. But they were not the only tribes of Amazigh or Proto-Amazigh people. There were others. There were the Ma or the Mashwash or Meshwesh, again, depending on how you think it was pronounced. And they would, at several times, contend with the Egyptians in these large-scale tribal confederations where they would either raid the Egyptians or straight up invade them. And this is something that eventually the Egyptians try to utilize these people, and they do for a period of time. But eventually there will be a Libyan dynasty of pharaohs, or at least it's believed to be Libyan in origin. There are some debate on that, but I do think, at the very least, there was at least one dynasty that was ethnically Amazigh, or Proto-Amazigh. But we know of at least two from these earliest periods, but there were definitely more than that. And I think there are several mentioned in Greek sources. The Carthaginians, we know that they interacted with them. And these people, very important to trade in the region through all of history. And we have evidence of them interacting with, of course, people south of the Sahara. They kind of are important in establishing routes between Oasi, and one of the only ways to get through to sub-Saharan Africa is going south from Morocco, or modern Morocco, Algeria, and they are kind of at the forefront of those journeys, especially once the camel is domesticated in this region. And again, that's another thing I want to point out. People think, oh, you can't get to the Sahara until like modern times, but no, you can. It was very hard to do, and you couldn't do it at any kind of real scale until a little bit later. But the Sahara is not a just flat out impassable, inhospitable wasteland. It's been described by a bunch of people as a sieve, essentially, just kind of really grinding down the numbers of people that can make those journeys. But the sub-Saharan Africans are not the only people that the Amazigh people are facilitating trade with. There is a very long history with trade with Europeans as well, specifically in Iberia, or Spain, as we would say today, or Spain and Portugal. And it is to that region that we're going to turn now. Now, I haven't really covered them too much, but there was a pre-historical society, tool culture known as the Ibero-Maurusian. Excuse me, I know I butchered that. And it means of Iberia and Mauritania, which was kind of like a catch-all term for kind of the northern coast of Africa, from the Atlantic to kind of like where today modern Tunis is. And this is a very long-lasting culture. There are a number of type sites, and it lasts potentially from like 2,500 to, about 2,300 BC to about 9,000. It's very long-lasting. We have a number of sites. There's not a whole lot to really say about them other than that they did have contacts both in southern Iberia and North Africa. And there was probably a steady amount of migration between the two regions. However, once about, 9,000 BC breaks down, or 9,000 BC arrives, the culture kind of splits apart, at least to an extent. There's obviously still interactions between the two groups, but there is kind of a divide in geography, where different groups begin to practice different things. And the divide is in Morocco. Morocco, you do not see the next culture come about. This This culture in Morocco is more closely tied to Iberia. That's not to say it originated in Iberia. It could have originated in Morocco. But you see a lot of the same artifacts in the Iberian part of the former Ibero-Mauritian culture. And then you have the kind of the parts from Algeria to Libya, where you have the Capsian culture emerge. And the culture in Morocco, Iberia, is called the Cardium pottery culture. Though, again, this is not a hard border. This is just where you'll find the majority of their artifacts. There's definitely interactions between the two groups. There's still trade links, conflicts, all that kind of stuff that you would expect to find in these two neighboring societies. Now, the Capsian culture begins to kind of differentiate itself from the old Ibero-Mauritian culture right around 8000 BC. However, they don't really enter the Neolithic until a couple hundred years before this season starts. At that time, though, you begin to see them develop a little bit more of a, I guess the term would be a complex toolkit than the Ibero-Mauritian has had. And this is kind of situated in the Atlas Mountains going south into modern-day Tunis. And the Atlas Mountains are the mountains that stretch from Morocco all the way to Tunis. And the area is, even today, much greener than most imagine. Obviously, if you live in the area, you're familiar with it. You know that it's not this desert wasteland that a lot of Americans, at least, associate with the region. It's very green. There are still plenty of lakes and rivers. I think you have several saltwater lakes in Tunis specifically. Not to mention, freshwater ponds and things like that. But the Capsian culture, the area is still greener than it is today. And it remains so for quite a while. It's more of a savanna, so you have a lot more shrub lands and things like that. But they had a pretty diverse diet. We know that they ate, of course, antelope. They caught hares. They farmed snails, essentially. They had wild aurochs, things like that. We're not so sure what type of plants they were eating, but they definitely ate them. And they probably, they definitely ate animals that ate the plants. So, there is that. And there's also evidence, not a lot of it, but there is some that they had domesticated goats, probably, maybe sheep at this early period, though these appear to have been imported, probably from people who had come from the Middle East and marched through, instead of going south through the Nile, they kind of probably kept to the coastlines. And this culture emerges a couple of hundred years before the season starts. At least that's when they entered their Neolithic phase. They've probably been around a little bit longer. And so there's a high likelihood that they had continual links with peoples to their east and, of course, to their cousins in the west. They had ostrich eggshells that they would use to make beads and containers. They used seashell necklaces. They would make art and rock art, both figurative and kind of abstract art. They used red ochre. Not surprising. This is something that people all over the world are still doing. And we have found tombs of theirs, so they were burying their dead in a kind of a ritualistic fashion, so they probably had some concept of religion, possibly an afterlife. They were buried on their sides. We have found some of their skeletal remains. But yeah, they're firmly in the Neolithic by this season. The name for this culture comes from Capsa, which was a Roman town, or at least that's what the Romans called it. I'm not sure if they found it or not, but today it's in Tunis it's called Gafsa or Kafsa, with a Q or a G depending on which in which whichever version of Anglicization you're looking at. But yeah, so this culture is going to be around for a little while longer, and there are still some links to older practices. One thing that it kind of ties them back into the Ibero-Mauritian is that they would extract like the incisors from the teeth, or from the jaw. But this is done less and less as time goes on. So this is an older cultural practice tying them to these groups to the west that they eventually abandoned. So that's kind of one of the reasons that it is suspected, because unfortunately I don't think we've had much luck in getting too much in-depth DNA from these people's remains that we found, but that does show that there is a connection, not just to people, back migrating from the Middle East or from the Nile Delta region, but they have those links too, but they also have links to their west. So this is kind of a new culture emerging as kind of maybe a synthesis of those two groups. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, to move on to the Cardium culture, or the Cardium pottery culture, excuse me. I talked about these peoples last season. I believe it was the border between the old and the new, I think was the episode title where I talked about these peoples. The first European farmers, the early European farmers, and how they were kind of sailing around the Mediterranean. They did end up in Iberia, and it is through, sailing around the coasts that they entered into, eventually, North Africa. And we do have some DNA for these people. Now, it's not from this season. It's from next season. About 3,700. And it shows almost a perfect half-and-half mix between the early European farmers and the ancient North Africans. Now, the Cardium culture ends about 5,500 is, I guess, when it kind of begins to break apart. So they definitely would have had to get here by at least 5,000 BC at the absolute latest. So it's not, the heartland of the Cardium culture, but they take their process of impressing their pottery with these seashell designs, and it continues. It's possible they were there as early as 5,600, 5,500, but the absolute latest would have been about 5,000. But again, we see kind of this older toolkit, still Neolithic, but not quite as diverse as what you'll see in the Capsian culture. But these early peoples do mix in very well with the ancient North Africans. And eventually, these peoples will move to the west. They will go south through the Atlas Mountains, and then they'll sail across the sea to the Canary Islands. Now, this doesn't happen until much later, but there doesn't appear to be any more big genetic shifts. So this culture kind of hangs around in this area for a little bit longer. It doesn't have a true replacement name, at least as far as I could tell. But this is how farming is introduced to this area of North Africa. And, there are plenty of crops associated with these early European farmers. That's how they get to this portion of Africa, and not from say, the Middle East directly. But they will continue to have trade links again with peoples to the east. However, they are also still trading with groups to the north. So there is a long-term connection, as there had been in the past, between Northern Africa and Southern Iberia. And this is not changing. This is something that's going to continue throughout history. There is probably migration to and back migration from Iberia from these mixed groups of early European farmers and North Africans. So just keep that in mind. We'll probably talk about more of these connections when we cover Iberia. That's kind of what we're working with. And again, the land is much more fertile than it is today, though today there are still plenty of fertile regions. But that is something to keep in mind. Now, I should also point out that there are those that think it's possible that some of the Iberians some of the ancient Moroccans had already been in southern Iberia when the Cardium culture arrived, and that's certainly possible too. So it's possible that the mixing actually happened in Iberia, and then these Moroccan groups came back to their old homeland. So that is a theory. We can't really say. We'd have to find DNA from earlier sources than what we have, which right now I think is around 3700 BC. So again, sometime next season. So it is very possible that Neolithic Iberia has influences before the Europeans arrived, before the early European farmers arrived. It's possible that there was more of a continuity between the rest of Iberia and North Africa than has currently been, imagined. And as you might guess from the Ibero-Maurician name and artifacts, but the question is always, where did that group emerge from? Did it emerge from Europe? Did it emerge from North Africa? That's a big debate that I can't answer because I'm not a specialist, but does it really matter at that early stage? Probably not. But it is something to keep in mind that it is possible that the center of that culture was in North Africa, and then the early European farmers move in, and then they move back to North Africa from there. So just keep that in mind. Let's see. Is there anything else? I feel like I'm forgetting something I wanted to talk about. I thought this would take a little bit longer to do. I thought I'd have to break this one up into a two-parter. But maybe not. I'm going through my notes here. I'm sure I'm going to forget, and then 40 minutes after I've got everything rendered and ready to post, I'm going to remember it. But if you guys do think I missed anything, or if you know that I missed something, or if you have any questions because I was rambling, please let me know. You can always reach me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can contact me via direct message on Twitter. And you are also able to comment on the YouTube videos. I do respond, though it sometimes may take me a day or two to see those comments. I don't check every day. But you can also come by YouTube when I'm live streaming. I stream most of the week, during the week itself, and sometimes on the weekends. I will be streaming tomorrow. I am going to be starting a new campaign in Europa Universalis 4. I just did a very fun Bengal run. I played as the Indian nation of Bengal and united the Indian subcontinent. And I don't really know what I'm going to be doing tomorrow, but I might do a campaign as Morocco or Tunis or something. So come on by and please subscribe. rate the podcast wherever you're listening on it. It helps the channel, it helps the feed grow, all that kind of stuff. So, thank you all for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed. And I hope to see you next week, and I hope you have a good rest of your day and week. And I will see you all next time, where we'll be moving into Asia, and we'll be talking about the Levant, and then we'll be moving on from there. So, thank you all. I hope you have a good night. Goodbye.